81 years on this earth, and my own daughter couldn't be bothered to show up on time for my birthday dinner. I'm Franklin Harlow, Frank to most folks around Willow Bend, and I've been watching the clock tick past 7:30, knowing full well Samantha and Dennis would roll in whenever they pleased. The sound of Dennis's oversized Suburban, finally crunching up my gravel drive, came at 7:45 through the window. I watched Samantha checking her phone while Dennis struggled with an armload of grocery store flowers, wilted daisies that probably cost him $8 at Safeway. Behind them, my two grandchildren, Tyler and Madison, ages 16 and 14, never looked up from their phones. "Happy birthday, Dad!" Samantha's voice had that forced cheer she'd perfected over the years, the kind you use when you're going through motions. She kissed my cheek, quick, efficient, like checking an item off a to-do list. Dennis gave me one of those firm handshakes he thought made him look important, his real estate agent smile plastered across his face. The dinner I'd spent 3 hours preparing, pot roast the way my late wife Martha used to make it, mashed potatoes from scratch, green beans from my own garden, might as well have been cardboard. Dennis cut his meat while scrolling through emails. Samantha pushed food around her plate, muttering about some client emergency at the insurance office. Tyler and Madison acted like I was furniture. "So Europe this summer," Dennis announced between bites, not bothering to look at me. 3 weeks. London, Paris, Rome. The kids are finally old enough to appreciate the culture. He said it like he was discussing the weather, completely oblivious to the fact that I'd been talking about wanting to see Ireland for the past decade. Samantha nodded enthusiastically. "We'll need someone to keep an eye on our place while we're gone. You know how it is in these neighborhoods, packages getting stolen, break-ins." She turned to me with that patronizing smile. "Dad, you wouldn't mind checking on the house, would you? Maybe watering the plants?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a locomotive. 3 weeks in Europe, the grandest adventure they'd probably ever take, and I was being assigned house-sitting duty like some retired handyman. I thought about the stack of travel brochures hidden in my desk drawer. Ireland, Scotland. The places Martha and I never got to see because we were too busy paying for Samantha's college, her wedding, her endless financial emergencies. "I mean, it's not like you're going anywhere," Dennis added with a chuckle that made my jaw clench. "At your age, traveling's more trouble than it's worth anyway. All those security lines walking through airports. Better to stay comfortable at home." At my age, 81 years old, and apparently that made me some kind of invalid. I'd been running complex locomotive systems when Dennis was still wetting his pants. I'd served 2 tours in Korea when travel meant dodging enemy fire, not dealing with TSA agents. I owned 47 acres of prime Oregon forest, 3 rental cabins that brought in steady income, and a collection of vintage automobiles that most men half my age would envy. But to them, I was just old Frank, good for watching houses and asking no questions. After they left, Tyler and Madison never having said more than thanks for dinner while texting their friends, I sat in my living room looking at the deeds locked in my oak filing cabinet. Property titles, stock certificates, the kind of documentation that represents a lifetime of careful planning and hard work. Next to them, my old Army footlocker held maps from my service days, including detailed topographical surveys of terrain most people never see. The phone rang twice that evening. Both times, friends from town asking about birthday celebrations. Both times, I gave them the same answer. Quiet evening at home. No point in telling them the truth, that my own family saw me as nothing more than a convenient caretaker for their empty house. Around 11 o'clock, I walked through my house, turning off lights, checking the locks the way Martha and I used to do every night for 38 years of marriage. In the bathroom mirror, I caught sight of my reflection. Gray hair, weathered hands, the face of a man who'd seen plenty of storms and survived them all. Dennis was wrong about one thing. I might be 81, but I wasn't dead yet. Standing in my bedroom, looking out at the forest that stretched beyond my property line, I thought about all the places I'd never seen, all the adventures I'd postponed for family obligations. Martha used to say I was too generous for my own good, always putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own dreams. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time that changed. I turned off the bedside lamp and settled into bed, But sleep didn't come easily. Instead, I found myself thinking about logistics. The way I used to plan complex freight routes through mountain passes. Every successful journey starts with understanding your resources, mapping your route, and knowing exactly where you want to end up. Just before midnight, lying in the darkness with moonlight filtering through Douglas fir branches outside my window, I whispered the words that would change everything. I've got one trip left in me. The decision settled into my bones like steel cooling after being forged, solid and unbreakable. They wanted to treat me like I was invisible? Fine, soon enough, I would be. The red taillights of Dennis's Suburban disappeared around the bend on Timber Ridge Road at exactly 6:47 a.m. I know because I'd been watching from my kitchen window, coffee growing cold in my hands, waiting for them to leave for their grand European adventure. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were heading to see the world while expecting me to watch their empty house like some kind of loyal guard dog. I walked to my front door and turned the deadbolt with more finality than I'd felt in years. The sound echoed through my house, a solid, decisive click that seemed to separate my old life from whatever was coming next. For the first time in months, maybe years, I was completely alone with my thoughts and my plans. The first stop was my home office, a converted bedroom where I'd handled railroad paperwork for decades after retiring. Martha used to joke that I'd turned it into mission control, with filing cabinets lined up like train cars and everything organized with the precision of a switching yard. She wasn't wrong. When you're responsible for millions of dollars worth of freight moving through mountain passes, you learn that details matter. I opened the bottom drawer of my oak filing cabinet and removed a leather satchel that hadn't seen daylight in over 2 years. Inside, $85,000 in government savings bonds, purchased systematically over 30 years of railroad employment. Most people don't know about bonds anymore. They want instant everything, digital transactions, plastic cards. But bonds are patient investments, the kind that compound quietly while everyone else chases get-rich-quick schemes. Next to the bonds, my original land deed for the full 47 acres I'd purchased in 1978. The paper was yellowed now, but the legal description was as solid as the day I'd signed it. Beginning at the intersection of Timber Ridge Road and the old logging trail, thence north, every boundary marker, every easement, every mineral right clearly documented. This land had been my sanctuary, my investment, my legacy. At least, that's what I thought. My railroad pension documents were filed separately. Survivor benefits, healthcare provisions, the accumulated wealth of nearly 5 decades of steady employment. Dennis probably assumed I was living month to month on Social Security. The way he made comments about fixed incomes and being comfortable at home. He had no idea that railroad pensions from the old days were built to last, or that I'd been maxing out contribution limits since before he was born. I spread everything across my desk like I used to spread route maps in the locomotive cab, looking for the most efficient way to get from point A to point B. The difference was, this time I wasn't planning to haul freight. I was planning to disappear. The phone call to Leo Mendoza felt like reconnecting with a lost piece of myself. Leo and I had grown up 3 houses apart on Cedar Street, back when Willow Bend was still a logging town and most of our fathers worked in the mills. We'd gone to Korea together, came back together, and watched each other build lives in the same small town. The difference was, Leo had gone to law school on the GI Bill while I'd chosen the railroad. Both were good choices, but right now I needed his expertise more than my own. Frank Harlow. Leo's voice carried the warmth of old friendship mixed with professional curiosity. Don't tell me you're finally ready to update that will you've been putting off? Something like that, I said, settling into my desk chair. But first, I need to ask you about property transfers. Hypothetically speaking, what would happen if someone wanted to simplify their holdings quietly? Leo's pause told me he understood. This wasn't entirely hypothetical. We'd known each other too long for games. Simplify how? Real estate transactions require documentation, Frank. There's no such thing as quiet when it comes to property law. What about trusts? Corporate structures? You remember how the railroad used subsidiary companies to manage different aspects of operations? I could hear Leo's chair creaking as he shifted into lawyer mode. Now you're thinking strategically. Yes, there are ways to create separation between ownership and management. But Frank, what's this really about? You sound like you're planning something significant. I told him about the birthday dinner, about Europe, about being treated like a house sitter for my own daughter. Leo listened without interrupting, a lawyer's skill that served him well in friendship too. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. How serious are you about this, Frank? Dead serious. They want to treat me like I'm invisible? I'm going to grant their wish. Give me 48 hours to research some options. And Frank, don't do anything irreversible until we talk again. After hanging up with Leo, I pulled out my address book, the leather-bound kind that young people laugh at, filled with handwritten phone numbers accumulated over decades. I found the listing for Cascade Properties, a real estate firm that specialized in rural land sales. They'd been after me for years to list my rental cabins, claiming the market was hot for vacation properties. When I called, I used a different approach than they'd expect from friendly old Frank, who always said he wasn't ready to sell. "This is F. Harlow," I said, keeping my voice businesslike. "I have 3 rental properties I need to move quickly and quietly. Are you interested, or should I call your competitors?" The agent, somebody named Rodriguez, who'd left flyers in my mailbox for the past 2 years, suddenly became very interested indeed. "Mr. Harlow, I'd be delighted to help you. These are the cabins on Timber Ridge Road. We've had multiple inquiries about properties in that area. I want them listed immediately. No open houses, no signs, no publicity. Professional buyers only. Cash deals preferred. Can you handle that level of discretion?" "Absolutely, sir. Our corporate clients appreciate privacy. When would you like to schedule the listing appointments?" "Today, if possible. This afternoon." I hung up and walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the 3 small cabins I'd built with my own hands over the course of 15 years. Each one represented weekends spent with hammer and saw, learning carpentry skills through trial and error, creating something solid and valuable from raw materials. Martha had helped with the finish work, painting, landscaping, the small touches that made them feel like homes instead of just buildings. For 20 years, those cabins had provided steady rental income and a sense of accomplishment. I'd maintained them personally, screening tenants carefully, treating the properties like the investments they were. Samantha knew about them, of course. She'd probably assumed they'd eventually be part of her inheritance, along with the main house and the land. She'd assumed wrong about a lot of things. The rest of the day passed in a strange combination of calm preparation and building anticipation. I organized files, made lists, reviewed documents that I hadn't touched in years. Every piece of paper represented a decision point, a crossroads where I could choose to continue being the convenient old man who watched houses and asked no questions, or become something else entirely. Everything was falling into place like a complex switching operation in the railroad yard, multiple moving parts, precise timing, and a clear destination in mind. The only question remaining was how far I was willing to take this train once it left the station. The photo album sat heavy in my lap as I turned pages filled with memories that felt both distant and immediate. Martha's funeral, 1998. Samantha was 27 then, lost and grieving, leaning on me like I was the only solid thing left in her world. In the pictures, I could see the exhaustion in my own face, the weight of trying to be strong enough for both of us while my own heart was breaking. People don't understand what it means to raise a grown daughter who's forgotten how to function. Samantha had been married to her college boyfriend for 3 years when Martha died, but somehow the loss of her mother sent her spiraling backward into helplessness. I'd sold 24 acres of my timberland to pay for her college education at Oregon State, prime forest land that I'd planned to keep in the family, trees that had been growing since before I was born. But Samantha wanted to be a teacher. And teachers needed degrees, and degrees cost money. 24 acres turned into 4 years of tuition, room, board, and spending money. I never regretted it, not even when she quit teaching after 2 years to work in insurance sales. The railroad had taught me that investments take time to pay off. You build track inch by inch, mile by mile, and eventually you have something that can carry freight across mountains. I thought I was building something similar with my daughter, investing in her education, her future, her ability to stand on her own. Maybe I was, but the return on investment wasn't what I'd expected. After Martha died, Samantha's marriage fell apart within 6 months. She moved back into her old bedroom like she was 18 again, bringing boxes of belongings and a broken heart. For 2 years, she lived in my house while she figured things out, which mainly involved working part-time at the insurance office and spending evenings watching television while I cooked dinner and did laundry. Those were lonely years for both of us. I suppose she was mourning her marriage and her mother, while I was trying to figure out how to be a widower after 38 years of partnership. We were both learning new roles we'd never wanted to play. Dennis came along in 2001, all confidence and smooth talk about real estate opportunities and investment strategies. He had a way of making everything sound like a sure thing, especially when he was talking to a grieving daughter who wanted to believe in happy endings again. I watched Samantha bloom under his attention, watched her laugh again, watched her start planning a future that didn't revolve around her father's house. When they got engaged, Dennis approached me man to man about starting his own real estate agency. "The market's exploding, Frank," he said, using the familiar tone that was supposed to make us feel like partners. "Interest rates are low, developments happening everywhere. I just need $70,000 for licensing, office space, initial marketing. Think of it as an investment in Samantha's future. $70,000. The amount rolled around in my head like cargo shifting in a freight car. It was more money than most people saw in a lifetime, but I had it. Railroad pensions and careful savings had been good to me, and Samantha deserved a chance at happiness with someone who could provide for her. "I'll write you a check," I told Dennis, "but I want a formal loan agreement, interest rate, payment schedule, the works. I'm not running a charity here." "Come on, Frank, we're family." That was to help us get started. "You didn't really expect us to pay that back, did you?" Actually, yes. I had expected that, but Samantha was happy. They were building a life together, and making waves seemed petty. So I let it go, the way I'd let a lot of things go over the years. Family harmony seemed more valuable than money, at least until family harmony started feeling like family exploitation. The grandchildren arrived in 2007 and 2009. Tyler and Madison, two beautiful babies who turned me into the kind of grandfather who kept pictures in his wallet and candy in his pockets. For their early years, I was essential, babysitting when Dennis and Samantha wanted date nights, emergency daycare when their regular arrangements fell through, birthday parties in my backyard, Christmas mornings that started at my house. I taught Tyler how to fish in Willow Creek, how to identify different types of trees in the forest, how to use basic tools in my workshop. Madison and I planted a garden together, raised tomatoes and beans and squash that she'd harvest with pride every summer. They were the joy of my later years, the reason I kept photo albums and told stories about the old days. But children grow up and grandparents become less essential. Tyler discovered video games and stopped wanting to hear about railroad adventures. Madison got interested in friends and social media, and my stories about the Korean War started sounding ancient and irrelevant. By the time they were teenagers, I'd become background furniture in their lives, present but not particularly noticed. The Willow Bend Railroad Museum had been my retirement project, a way to preserve local history and stay connected to the industry that had defined my working years. I donated thousands of hours to the project, organizing artifacts, writing exhibit descriptions, leading tours for school groups who wanted to learn about steam engines and freight operations. More than that, I donated money, substantial amounts over 15 years. When the museum needed a new roof, I wrote a check. When they wanted to restore an authentic 1920s caboose, I funded the project. When the county threatened to cut their operating budget, I quietly established an endowment to keep them running. But even at the museum, I was careful not to take too much credit for my contributions. The donation plaque said anonymous donor or friends of the museum. I preferred it that way, letting the work speak for itself rather than seeking recognition. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe being invisible became too much of a habit. Sitting in my office now, surrounded by documents and memories, I could see the pattern clearly. 47 years of working and saving and building, and what did I have to show for it? A family that took me for granted, investments that had been treated like gifts, grandchildren who saw me as furniture. The railroad had taught me about momentum, how much energy it takes to get something moving, and how much energy it takes to stop it once it's rolling. For decades, I'd been moving in the same direction, giving, supporting, accommodating, putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own. That momentum had carried me through Martha's death, through raising Samantha again, through Dennis's schemes and the grandchildren's indifference. But momentum can change direction. It requires force, planning, and determination, but it can be done. The question was whether I had the strength to apply that force, to redirect all that accumulated energy towards something that served my interests for a change. I picked up a legal pad and started writing names, amounts, dates, a careful inventory of everything I'd given and everything I was owed. Not because I expected repayment, but because I needed to understand the scope of what I was dealing with. The numbers were larger than I'd realized, the pattern more consistent than I'd wanted to admit. When I finished, I set the legal pad aside and opened a fresh document on my computer. At the top, I typed, "Last Will and Testament of Franklin James Harlow." Below that, I began drafting provisions that would ensure my life's work went to people who understood its value: the museum, the historical society, scholarship funds for local students who wanted to learn trades or engineering. As for my family, well, they'd made their priorities clear. They wanted me to be invisible, to watch their house while they lived their lives. Maybe it was time to grant that wish more completely than they'd intended. 5:15 in the morning, and I was backing my 1965 Mustang out of the barn for the first time in 3 years. The engine turned over smooth as silk. I'd kept her maintained even when I wasn't driving her, changing oil every 6 months and running the engine monthly to keep everything lubricated. That's what railroad training teaches you. Machines that aren't maintained become expensive mistakes. The Mustang was my secret from the family, purchased with cash in 2005 from an estate sale in Portland. The widow had no idea what she had. 289 V8 engine, original Wimbledon white paint, red interior that looked like it had rolled off the dealer lot yesterday. I'd paid $12,000 for what was probably worth $40,000 now, maybe more. Dennis would have insisted I sell it if he'd known about it. Dangerous for a man your age, he would have said. Insurance liability, maintenance costs. What if you have a medical emergency while driving? All the patronizing concerns that translate to, why do you need anything that brings you joy? But they didn't know about the Mustang, just like they didn't know about a lot of things. The barn behind my house looked like any other outbuilding from the road. Weathered siding, functional metal roof, the kind of structure every rural property has for storing equipment and supplies. What they couldn't see was the climate-controlled garage space I'd built inside, complete with hydraulic lift and professional tool setup. Highway 62 stretched south toward Medford and beyond, 2 lanes of asphalt that had carried me to work for decades, but never to adventure. The railroad had always been my highway, steel rails that connected Willow Bend to Seattle, Portland, Sacramento, everywhere that mattered for freight transportation. But personal travel? That had always been postponed, delayed. Something we'll do when I retire that turned into something we'll do when the finances are more secure that turned into something we'll do next year, until there were no more next years with Martha. Ashland was 45 minutes south, far enough to be anonymous, but close enough to handle practical matters. I'd chosen it carefully after researching online, reading about rental availability and public transportation. The apartment complex I'd researched was called Cedar Grove, one of those mid-range places that cater to temporary residents, visiting professors, seasonal workers, people between permanent housing situations. The manager, a pleasant woman named Carol, had been helpful when I'd called the previous day using my middle name instead of Frank. "We have a lovely 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor," Carol had replied, "facing the courtyard, very peaceful. Are you familiar with Ashland?" "I'm familiar with the area. I prefer to handle transactions in cash if that's acceptable. Cash opens doors that credit applications complicate." Carol was more than happy to accept first month's rent plus deposit in cash, along with a simple rental agreement that required minimal documentation. By 7:30 that morning, I had keys to a furnished apartment and a parking space in a covered garage. The apartment was exactly what I'd needed. Clean, functional, anonymous. Standard furniture, basic kitchen, cable television, internet connection, everything required for temporary living. Nothing that would create emotional attachment. I unpacked the single suitcase I'd brought, hanging clothes in a closet that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and fresh paint. From the apartment's window, I could see Ashland's downtown area, coffee shops, bookstores, restaurants, the kind of walkable community that attracts retirees with active lifestyles. Perfect cover for an elderly man who wanted to blend into the background while conducting business that required privacy. The safety deposit box at Ashland Community Bank had been arranged the previous week, also under the name James Harlow. Inside, vintage railroad stock certificates from companies that had been absorbed by larger corporations over the decades, collectible coins that I'd accumulated during 47 years of railroad travel, a small collection of gold pieces that Martha had inherited from her father. People think of wealth in terms of bank balances and investment portfolios, digital numbers that can be frozen or seized with court orders. But physical assets, stocks printed on paper, precious metals, collectibles with intrinsic value, those require different approaches for anyone wanting to interfere with them. You have to know they exist first, and you have to prove ownership second. The stock certificates alone were probably worth $250,000, maybe more. Railroad memorabilia had become increasingly valuable as fewer people remembered when trains were the primary means of long-distance transportation. Investors who specialized in transportation history paid premium prices for authentic documentation from the golden age of railroading. The coins were a different story. Silver dollars, gold eagles, commemorative pieces that Martha had collected based on historical interest rather than investment strategy. But precious metals hold value regardless of the collector's intent, and I'd learned enough about commodity markets during my railroad years to understand that gold and silver were inflation hedges that couldn't be manipulated by family members with legal ambitions. By noon, I was sitting in a downtown Ashland cafe drinking coffee and reading the Medford Mail Tribune like any other retiree with time on his hands. The normalcy felt surreal, ordering lunch, making small talk with the waitress, watching other customers go about their daily routines while knowing that my own life had just taken a sharp turn onto unmapped tracks. My phone buzzed with a text message from Leo. "Paperwork is ready for review. When can we meet?" I typed back, "Tomorrow afternoon." "Your office." Leo would be surprised that I was suddenly available for afternoon meetings, but that was a conversation for tomorrow. The afternoon was spent walking around Ashland, familiarizing myself with the layout and services. Library with public computers and internet access. Post office for mail forwarding. Banks, restaurants, medical facilities, everything needed to support extended residence if necessary. I wasn't planning to stay long, but good planning means preparing for contingencies. That call wasn't going to come. Instead, tomorrow Leo would be filing paperwork that would change everything. Missing person reports have specific legal implications, particularly when the missing person owns substantial assets and has family members who might benefit from his disappearance. The timing had to be precise. The documentation ironclad. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, Maker's Mark, the good stuff I kept for special occasions, and sat by the apartment window watching Ashland's evening routine. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed through the valley. The lonesome sound that had been the soundtrack of my working life for nearly 5 decades. Tomorrow, the real journey would begin. Tonight, for the first time in years, I was exactly where I wanted to be, doing exactly what I'd chosen to do, with no one to answer to, except myself. It felt strange and wonderful, and slightly terrifying, like the first time I'd taken a locomotive out of the yard as a newly certified engineer. The phone started ringing at my house Wednesday afternoon, according to the neighbor who later told me about it. Mrs. Peterson from across the street watched Dennis's BMW pull into my driveway around 2 o'clock, saw him try the front door, then walk around to the back, looking increasingly agitated. I knew this because Mrs. Peterson called me Thursday morning at the apartment in Ashland. Dorothy Peterson was 78 years old, sharp as a tack, and had been keeping informal neighborhood watch for as long as I'd lived on Timber Ridge Road. More importantly, she was one of the few people who had my cell phone number and wasn't afraid to use it. "Frank, where the hell are you?" she asked, without preamble. "Your daughter and that husband of hers are crawling all over your property like ants at a picnic. They tried to get me to let them use my phone to call the sheriff about a welfare check." "What did you tell them?" "I told them you were a grown man who could come and go as he pleased, and if they were so worried about your welfare, maybe they should have thought about that before treating you like hired help." Dorothy had never been diplomatically inclined, which was one of her more endearing qualities. "Did they say what they were looking for?" "Documents, from what I could overhear. Something about power of attorney and medical directives. That son-in-law of yours was talking about freezing bank accounts until you could be located and assessed." His words, not mine. The speed of their response was instructive. 48 hours after finding an empty house, they'd already moved from concern to control. No assumption that I might be visiting friends, taking a short trip, or simply exercising my right to leave my own property. Instead, they'd jumped directly to the conclusion that I was incompetent and needed their management. "Dorothy, I need you to do me a favor. If they come back, you don't know where I am or when I'll be back. You haven't heard from me, and you're not particularly worried because I'm a capable adult who's been taking care of himself since before they were born." "Gladly. But Frank, what's this really about? You sound different." "I'm fine, Dorothy. Better than fine, actually. I'm just tired of being taken for granted." After hanging up, I called Leo at his law office. "They're moving faster than I expected. How quickly can we implement those legal protections we discussed?" "Already done," Leo replied. "As of yesterday afternoon, you revoked all existing power of attorney designations and updated your advance directives. Your medical decisions are now handled by a patient advocacy service. Your financial affairs are protected by explicit legal language, and any attempt to freeze your accounts without a court order constitutes financial harassment." Leo had been busy. We'd known each other long enough that he understood the stakes without requiring detailed explanations. When I'd told him about the birthday dinner and the Europe trip, he'd seen the same pattern I had: family members positioning themselves for maximum benefit with minimum effort. "What about the missing person angle? If they file a report, what happens?" "Interesting question. Oregon law requires evidence of endangered circumstances before authorities can take action regarding competent adults. Your note says you went hiking, which is a normal activity for someone with your outdoors experience. Legal frameworks fascinated me the same way railroad regulations had during my working years. Both were complex systems designed to prevent chaos while allowing legitimate operations to proceed smoothly. The key was understanding which rules applied to your specific situation, then operating within those boundaries while achieving your objectives. "There's something else," Leo continued. "I've been researching your property records as requested. Did you know that your daughter never actually received title to the house she thinks she owns?" That stopped me cold. "What do you mean?" "The property at 847 Maple Street in Medford. The house Dennis and Samantha live in. You co-signed the mortgage in 2003, but the deed shows you as joint owner, not guarantor. When they refinanced in 2010, somehow your name remained on the title, even though you're not on the new mortgage." I'd completely forgotten about that arrangement. Dennis had needed help qualifying for the original mortgage, and I'd agreed to co-sign based on their promise to handle all payments and eventually remove my name from the deed. Like so many financial favors I'd provided over the years, the removal part had never happened. "So legally, I own half their house?" "Legally, you own the entire house. Joint ownership with right of survivorship means that if anything happened to you, Samantha would inherit full ownership. But as long as you're alive, you have complete property rights. You could sell it, rent it, or reclaim it without her consent." The implications were staggering. For 20 years, they'd been living in a house I owned while treating me like a burden and an inconvenience. They'd built their family life, their social standing, their financial planning around a property that was legally mine. The irony was almost too perfect. "Leo, I want you to send them a notice. Nothing threatening, just a friendly reminder about property ownership and a request that they contact your office to discuss formalizing the arrangement. Today, while they're tearing apart my house looking for documents they don't need to control assets they can't access, the rest of Thursday passed quietly in Ashland. I walked through Lithia Park, ate lunch at a small restaurant, bought groceries like any other retired person, enjoying a peaceful afternoon. The normalcy was deliberate camouflage. If anyone was tracking my movements, they'd see exactly what they expected, an elderly man living simply and independently. Friday morning brought the call I'd been expecting. Samantha's voice was strained, anxious, nothing like the casual dismissal she'd shown at my birthday dinner. "Dad, where are you? We've been worried sick. Your house is empty. Your car is gone. Nobody knows where you are. We missed our flight to London because we were afraid something had happened to you." The concern in her voice might have touched me if it hadn't been coupled with immediate demands for information and control. This wasn't worry about my well-being. It was panic about their European vacation and their assumptions about my predictability. "I'm 81 years old, not incompetent. I've been hiking these mountains since before you were born, and I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. But Dad, we need to know where you are. We have responsibilities, obligations. What if the bank needs to reach you? What if there's a medical emergency? Responsibilities. Obligations. Interesting. How those had never applied to birthday dinners or family conversations, but became urgent when my predictability was disrupted. I could hear Dennis in the background, his voice low and insistent, probably coaching her on what to say. "Samantha, did you receive a letter from Leo Mendoza's office?" The pause told me everything I needed to know. "Yes, we got a letter. Dad, what's going on? Why is Leo involved? Are you having problems with thinking clearly?" With thinking clearly, the patronizing language that families use when they want to justify taking control of someone's life, as if wanting to travel independently and protect my assets, indicated mental decline rather than strategic planning. "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. Leo is helping me organize my affairs properly. You should read that letter carefully. Dad, please, just come home. We can talk about whatever's bothering you. If this is about the Europe trip, we can postpone it. We can plan a family vacation that includes everyone. Too little, too late." The offer of inclusion came only after they'd discovered that I couldn't be managed as easily as they'd assumed. If they'd made that offer 3 weeks ago, over birthday cake instead of dismissive comments about house-sitting, this conversation might have been different. "Samantha, I'll be back when I'm ready to be back. In the meantime, I suggest you and Dennis contact Leo's office to discuss that property situation he mentioned in his letter." I hung up before she could respond, then turned off the phone. By now, they'd probably received the letter about the rental cabins being sold. By Monday, they'd learn about the house ownership issue. The dominoes were falling exactly as I'd planned, and for the first time in decades I was the one setting them in motion, instead of cleaning up the mess after they fell. Formal but not threatening had been my guidance. I want them to understand their position without feeling attacked. Yet, the letter was a masterpiece of legal precision, wrapped in the respectful tone that Leo had perfected over 40 years of small-town law practice. From my apartment in Ashland, I could imagine Dennis opening the envelope, probably expecting some routine correspondence about estate planning or property taxes. Instead, he found 3 pages of legal letterhead that began, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Hoffman, I am writing on behalf of my client, Franklin James Harlow, to clarify certain legal matters that require your immediate attention." The first section dealt with power of attorney issues, specifically the revocation of all previously granted authorities and the establishment of new legal frameworks that protected my decision-making rights. Leo's language was crystal clear. Any attempt to freeze accounts, make medical decisions, or claim incompetency would constitute legal harassment subject to both civil and criminal penalties. The second section addressed property ownership, particularly the house at 847 Maple Street that they'd been treating as their own for 20 years. Leo had included copies of the original deed and all subsequent documentation, highlighting the legal reality that I remained the sole owner despite their mortgage payments and improvements. But the third section was the real surprise. Notice that Mr. Harlow had made substantial charitable contributions to various local organizations and was updating his will to reflect his current priorities and relationships. No specific amounts were mentioned, but the implications were clear enough for anyone with basic mathematical skills. Saturday evening brought the phone calls I'd been expecting. First, Samantha, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Dad, Leo says you donated $50,000 to some historical society. Is that true? It's true. The Willow Bend Historical Preservation Society needed funding to restore the old railroad depot downtown. I've been supporting them for years. $50,000, Dad. That's our inheritance you're giving away. Your inheritance. Not family money, not assets we built together, but their inheritance. The entitlement was breathtaking, even by their standards. Samantha, it's my money to give as I see fit. The Historical Society preserves local history. This isn't about the vacation. This is about you making financial decisions without consulting family. What if you need that money for medical care? What if there are emergencies? The concern about my future medical expenses was touching, coming from someone who hadn't asked about my current health status in months. I have excellent insurance and adequate reserves for any reasonable medical situation. The donation doesn't affect my personal security. Dennis took the phone then, his real estate agent voice shifting into negotiation mode. Frank, let's be practical here. $50,000 is a substantial sum. If you wanted to support local causes, we could have helped you research options, maybe found more efficient ways to maximize your charitable impact. More efficient ways. Translation: smaller donations spread over longer periods, keeping the bulk of the estate intact for eventual inheritance. Dennis had always been transparent about his priorities, even when he thought he was being subtle. Dennis, I've been researching local causes for 15 years. I know exactly where I want my money to go and why. But Frank, we're family. Shouldn't family have some input into major financial decisions that affect everyone's future? Family input. Like the input I'd received about the Europe trip, or the input they'd sought before treating me like hired help for house-sitting duties. Family input is welcome when it's offered respectfully and reciprocally. When did you last ask for my input on any decision that affected me? The silence stretched long enough to make the point. Finally, Samantha came back on the line. Dad, please, whatever we did wrong, we can fix it. Just come home so we can talk face to face. I'll come home when I'm ready. In the meantime, you should call Leo's office Monday morning to discuss the property situation. That's not something that can wait indefinitely. Sunday morning's Medford Mail Tribune carried a small item on page 3 that made me smile over coffee in the Ashland Cafe where I'd become a regular customer. Anonymous Donor Rescues Rail Museum read the headline, followed by a brief story about a generous contribution that would fund restoration projects and educational programs for the next 5 years. The article quoted the museum director, Patricia Williams, whom I'd worked with on dozens of volunteer projects over the years. This donation comes at a critical time when public funding for historical preservation has been reduced. The anonymous donor has been a longtime supporter of railroad history education, and this gift ensures we can continue serving school groups and preserving authentic artifacts for future generations. Anonymous donor. I'd specifically requested that my name not be used in any publicity, partly for privacy but mostly because I wanted the focus on the museum's work rather than the contributor's identity. Let Dennis and Samantha wonder how much more anonymous giving I'd been doing over the years. Monday morning brought the call I'd been expecting from Leo. They want a meeting, he reported. Dennis called first thing, very agitated about property ownership issues. Apparently they had no idea you were still on the deed for their house. What did you tell them? Options for resolving the situation. Leo's diplomatic language that meant Dennis and Samantha were about to learn that 20 years of assumption didn't equal legal ownership. When do they want to meet? Tomorrow afternoon, if possible. They seem anxious to clarify their position. Anxious was probably an understatement. They'd built their entire adult lives around the assumption that they owned their house, that my assets would eventually become their assets, that I would continue playing the role of predictable, manageable elderly relative who asked few questions and made fewer demands. Now they were discovering that assumptions aren't legally binding contracts, and that dismissing someone's autonomy doesn't guarantee their continued cooperation. The meeting would be educational for everyone involved. Leo, I want you to handle the meeting without me. Explain the legal realities, outline their options, but don't make it easy for them. They need to understand that their current situation is the result of their own assumptions and choices. What about long-term resolution? Do you want the house back, or are you willing to work out some arrangement? That was the essential question. I could reclaim the house immediately, forcing them to find new housing while dealing with their mortgage obligations. Or I could use the legal leverage to restructure our relationship on more equitable terms. The choice would depend partly on their response to tomorrow's reality check. Let's see how they handle the meeting first. Their attitude will determine my generosity. The afternoon was spent walking through Ashland's downtown area, observing a community that had learned to balance preservation with progress, tourism with local needs, individual interests with collective welfare. It was a good model for what I was trying to achieve, maintaining respect for the past while insisting on fair treatment in the present. By evening, sitting in my temporary apartment with a glass of wine and a good book, I felt more centered than I had in years. For the first time since Martha's death, I was operating from a position of strength rather than accommodation. The roles had reversed. Instead of wondering what my family expected from me, they were wondering what I expected from them. It was a healthier dynamic, and long overdue. Tomorrow's meeting would determine whether it could become a permanent arrangement, or whether more decisive measures would be necessary to protect my interests and dignity. Leo's call came Tuesday evening, while I was watching the sunset from my apartment balcony, the kind of peaceful moment that retirement was supposed to provide, but rarely did when family obligations kept interrupting. The meeting was illuminating, he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice that comes when legal documentation proves more powerful than wishful thinking. Dennis came in with a briefcase full of mortgage documents, insurance policies, and improvement receipts, apparently thinking he could prove ownership through payment history. Leo continued. I had to explain that paying someone else's mortgage doesn't transfer title, and that maintaining someone else's property doesn't create ownership rights. How did Samantha take the news? She went through several stages. Disbelief first, then anger, then something approaching panic when she realized the implications. She kept asking if there was some mistake in the paperwork, as if property records were subject to revision based on family assumptions. Leo had dealt with enough family disputes over his 4 decades of practice to recognize the patterns. Adult children who assumed their parents' assets were family property, spouses who confused their names on accounts with their rights to control them, relatives who treated generosity as obligation and accommodation as weakness. They want to meet with you directly, Leo said. Dennis specifically asked if this was some kind of negotiation tactic to get their attention. I told him it wasn't a negotiation, because you weren't asking for anything. You were simply clarifying legal realities they'd ignored. Negotiation tactic. Even confronted with documentary evidence of their assumptions, Dennis was framing the situation as some kind of manipulation rather than accepting responsibility for never clarifying the property arrangement in 2 decades of residence. What did you tell him about meeting with me? I told them you were considering various options for resolving the situation and that their flexibility and good faith would influence your decisions. I also mentioned that you'd been reviewing other financial arrangements that might benefit from similar clarification. Other financial arrangements. The $70,000 loan that Dennis had never repaid, never acknowledged, never even mentioned in recent years. Leo had been busy with his research, and the paper trail on that transaction was as solid as the property documentation. Wednesday morning brought news from an unexpected source. Carl Hendricks from the Internal Revenue Service called my cell phone directly, which was unusual enough to get my full attention. Carl and I had known each other since high school. He'd gone into accounting while I'd chosen railroads, but we'd maintained the kind of distant friendship that small towns facilitate. Fraud investigation. That was a development I hadn't anticipated, though it shouldn't have been surprising. Dennis's real estate business had always operated in the gray areas between legitimate sales strategies and creative interpretation of disclosure requirements. What kind of unreported income? Someone reported a $70,000 loan that was never properly documented for tax purposes. When we reviewed his business records, there's no mention of the loan, no repayment schedule, no interest payments. From the ARS perspective, that looks like unreported income that should have been declared in 2001. Someone had reported the loan. That someone was almost certainly Leo, acting on my behalf to ensure that all my financial transactions were properly documented for legal purposes. If Dennis wanted to treat the loan as a forgotten family gift, the IRS would treat it as taxable income that should have been reported 22 years ago. Absolutely. We've sent Dennis a notice requesting documentation and an explanation of the discrepancy. If he can't provide satisfactory records, we'll have to treat it as unreported income subject to back taxes, penalties, and interest. 22 years of compound interest and penalties on $70,000 would be a substantial financial burden, possibly more than the original amount. Dennis was about to learn that treating loans as gifts created tax consequences that compound annually. Thursday brought confirmation that word was spreading through Willow Bend's tight-knit community. Mrs. Peterson called with her usual directness. "Frank, people are talking about you being missing and making donations, and Dennis having tax troubles. What's going on?" Small towns are information ecosystems, where news travels through interconnected networks of longtime residents, longtime employees, longtime customers who've known each other's business for decades. Dorothy Peterson was a central node in that network, which made her both a valuable source and a potential amplifier. "What are people saying, Dorothy? Have you heard anything about Samantha and Dennis's travel plans?" "Cancelled. Word is they lost the deposits on their European trip, because they were too busy looking for you to make their flight. Some people think that's a shame. Most people think it's karma." Karma. The idea that consequences eventually find their way back to people who create them through their choices and actions. I'd never been particularly spiritual about such things, but 47 years of railroad work had taught me that momentum builds slowly and arrives with inevitable force. Friday afternoon brought the call I'd been expecting from Samantha. Her voice strained in ways I hadn't heard since Martha's funeral. "Dad, we need to talk. Dennis got a letter from the IRS about some loan from 2001. They're saying he owes back taxes and penalties. This is serious." "It sounds serious. What did the IRS letter say exactly?" "They're treating the $70,000 you gave Dennis as unreported income. They want documentation that it was a legitimate business loan, not a gift." "Dad, you remember that was a loan, right? There was supposed to be a repayment agreement?" "Supposed to be." Interesting how the family narrative had shifted now that tax consequences were involved. For 20 years the loan had been forgotten, dismissed, treated as an irrelevant piece of ancient history. Now suddenly it was a legitimate business arrangement that required documentation and legal protection. I remember writing Dennis a check for $70,000 in 2001. I remember him promising to sign loan documents and set up a repayment schedule. I don't remember receiving any payments or signed agreements. "But Dad, you know it was a loan. You can tell the IRS it was a legitimate business loan, not a gift. You can help clear this up." Help clear this up. After 2 decades of being treated like the family ATM, now they wanted my assistance to avoid the consequences of their own tax negligence. The irony was breathtaking, even by their standards. "Samantha, if Dennis wants to claim it was a loan, he needs to provide documentation that it was treated as a loan. Payment records, signed agreements, interest calculations. That's what loans require." "Dad, please, the penalties and interest could be enormous. This could ruin us financially." "Samantha, I suggest you and Dennis contact Leo's office to discuss your options. There might be ways to resolve both the tax situation and the property ownership issues, but that will require good faith negotiations from everyone involved." Saturday morning brought the final piece of news that confirmed my strategy was working exactly as planned. Leo called with barely contained amusement. "You'll appreciate this. Dennis hired a private investigator to find you, thinking that would somehow solve his legal problems. What did the investigator discover? Nothing useful. Your credit cards haven't been used, Your bank accounts haven't been accessed from unusual locations. Your car registration hasn't been flagged by any law enforcement agency. As far as official records show, you've simply exercised your right to privacy and mobility. The investigator had been looking for someone who was hiding, rather than someone who was simply living independently under his own name in a nearby town. The assumption that I was incapacitated or lost had blinded them to the simpler explanation that I was exactly where I wanted to be, doing exactly what I'd chosen to do. Leo, I think it's time for the final phase. Send Dennis a formal demand letter for repayment of the loan, with accumulated interest calculated at standard rates. Give him 30 days to respond with either payment or a realistic settlement proposal. And if he doesn't respond, then we file suit for recovery of the loan and let him explain to a judge why a business loan never generated any business records, payments, or tax documentation. The pieces were falling into place exactly as I'd planned. Dennis would soon receive a court summons that would make his IRS problems look simple by comparison. Sometimes the best way to teach respect is to demonstrate the cost of its absence. My first stop wasn't my own house, but the Railroad Museum on Main Street, where I'd spent countless volunteer hours during my retirement years. Patricia Williams looked up from the artifact catalog she was updating, her face breaking into the kind of genuine smile that comes from authentic appreciation rather than family obligation. "Frank, we've been wondering where you disappeared to. Thank you for that generous donation. It's going to make such a difference for our educational programs." She gestured toward the museum's main display area, where restoration work was already underway on the 1920s caboose that had needed attention for years. "The museum deserves support," I replied, settling into the chair beside her desk that had become my regular spot during planning meetings. Railroad history is worth preserving, especially for young people who've never seen how transportation used to work. We talked for an hour about the museum's expansion plans, the new educational materials being developed, the school groups scheduled for tours in the coming months. Patricia treated me as a valued colleague, whose opinions mattered, whose expertise was respected, whose continued involvement was both welcome and important. It was the kind of conversation I'd forgotten was possible. Two competent adults discussing shared interests and mutual goals, without anyone questioning my capabilities or offering unsolicited advice about what was appropriate for someone my age. The contrast with recent family interactions was striking. My next stop was Milligan's Diner on 2nd Street, where Martha and I had shared Sunday morning coffee for 20 years and where I'd continued eating breakfast most weekdays since retiring. "Took a little time away to handle some business matters," I replied, settling onto my usual stool at the counter. Sometimes a man needs space to think clearly about his priorities. The other customers nodded knowingly. Most were retired themselves, old enough to understand that family relationships could become complicated when adult children started making assumptions about their parents' capabilities and resources. "Your daughter was in here last week," Bob continued while pouring my coffee, "asking if anyone had heard from you, looking pretty upset about something. That husband of hers was with her, seemed all wound up about property issues and legal problems." Property issues and legal problems. The news had already spread through Willow Bend's informal communication network, which meant Dennis and Samantha were dealing with public scrutiny in addition to their private difficulties. Small-town life had disadvantages, but it also provided accountability that cities couldn't match. The afternoon was spent visiting other familiar places: the hardware store where I'd bought materials for countless home improvement projects, the bank where I'd conducted business for 40 years, the gas station where I'd filled up before every railroad shift. Each stop reinforced the same message. I was a respected member of this community, someone whose independence and competence were recognized and valued. By evening, I was back at my own house, walking through rooms that felt simultaneously familiar and different. The silence was peaceful rather than lonely, the solitude comfortable rather than isolating. For the first time since Martha's death, I felt truly at home in my own space. Samantha reached me first, her face a mixture of relief and anxiety. "Dad, thank God you're okay. We've been so worried about you." "I'm fine, Samantha. I told you I would be." Reasonable family members. Interesting how Dennis discovered the value of family collaboration when legal consequences started affecting his financial security. For the past decade, reasonable had meant accepting whatever arrangements they proposed without question or negotiation. What did you want to discuss, Dennis? The $70,000 loan from 2001. I know we never formalized the paperwork, but you know it was legitimate business financing. You can help us explain that to the IRS. Clear up this misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. As if 22 years of non-payment was simply an oversight that could be corrected with the right explanation. Dennis, if it was a legitimate business loan, where are your business records? Payment schedules, interest calculations? Frank, you know how it was back then. We were family, we trusted each other. Formal documentation seemed unnecessary when we had a personal relationship. Personal relationship, the same personal relationship that had included dismissing my travel interests, excluding me from family planning, treating me like hired help for house-sitting duties. Personal relationships require mutual respect, Dennis. When did you last demonstrate respect for my opinions or preferences? Samantha stepped between us, her voice taking on the pleading tone she'd perfected during her difficult divorce years. Dad, whatever we did wrong, we're sorry. We can change. We can be a better family. Can you? When was the last time you asked about my health, my interests, my plans? When was the last time you included me in family decisions that affected me? When was the last time you treated me like a person whose opinions mattered rather than an obligation you had to manage? The questions hung in the air between us. Samantha looked uncomfortable. Dennis looked frustrated. And I felt the clarity that comes from finally speaking truth that had been accumulating for years. Everything. Their house that I actually owned, their financial security that depended on assets they'd assumed would eventually be theirs, their social standing that was built on credit rather than actual wealth. Samantha, maybe losing everything would teach you to value what you actually have, instead of assuming what you think you deserve. Dennis's patience finally snapped. Frank, this is ridiculous. You're acting like a child who didn't get his way. We're family, we should be working together, not fighting over ancient history and legal technicalities. Ancient history. Legal technicalities. His dismissive language revealed exactly what I'd suspected. Dennis saw my legitimate concerns as inconvenient obstacles to his financial planning, rather than serious issues that deserved respectful resolution. Dennis, you're right about one thing. We should have been working together all along. The problem is, working together requires mutual respect and good faith from everyone involved. As they walked back to their cars, I could hear Dennis muttering about stubborn old men and unreasonable demands. Samantha was crying quietly, probably more from stress than genuine remorse. I watched their cars disappear down Timber Ridge Road, then sat back down on my porch with my coffee. The morning was peaceful, quiet except for birds in the Douglas firs and the distant sound of a freight train passing through town. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace in my own life. As I hung up the phone, I whispered the words that felt like a benediction. Good men don't beg for thanks. They earn respect through their actions. They give because it's right, and they protect their dignity because nobody else will do it for them. The idea came to me while reading the local newspaper's coverage of the housing crisis affecting elderly residents throughout southern Oregon. Rising costs, limited availability, families scattered across the country. Too many people my age were struggling with basic shelter needs, while I lived alone in a house designed for a large family. Martha and I had built this house in 1967, with children in mind, back when families stayed close and 3 generations might share Sunday dinner around the same table. 4 bedrooms, 2 full bathrooms, a kitchen designed for serious cooking, and a living room large enough for holiday gatherings that stopped happening after Martha died. Now, the house felt both too large and too quiet, filled with furniture and memories but empty of the laughter and conversation it had been designed to accommodate. Rather than rattling around in all that space while other seniors struggled with housing insecurity, why not create something that served the community instead of just my solitude? The legal mechanics were simpler than I'd expected. Leo helped me establish the Harlow Community Trust, a structure that could operate the house as transitional housing for displaced seniors, while protecting my ownership rights and ensuring professional management. Not a nursing home or assisted living facility, but temporary shelter for people who needed time to find permanent solutions. It's an innovative approach, Leo said when we finalized the paperwork. Transitional housing for seniors is desperately needed, and your property is perfectly suited for it. The separate entrance to the basement level means you can maintain privacy while providing services. The basement renovation took 6 weeks, and most of my remaining summer. Professional contractors handled the major work, plumbing, electrical, fire safety systems, while I managed details that required railroad precision, scheduling, quality control, budget management. It felt good to be building something again, creating value rather than simply maintaining what already existed. The finished space included 2 private bedrooms with shared bathroom facilities, a small kitchen area, and a comfortable sitting room that opened onto the backyard through new French doors. Not luxurious, but dignified and functional. The kind of housing that allowed people to maintain independence while accessing support services. My first resident was Eleanor Vasquez, an 83-year-old widow whose apartment building had been sold to developers and converted to expensive condominiums. Eleanor had worked for 30 years as a school secretary, raised 4 children, and contributed to every church fundraiser and community volunteer project in Willow Bend. She deserved better than the alternatives she'd been facing. "Frank, I can't believe you're doing this," she said when I showed her the renovated space. "It's beautiful, and I promise I'll be out of your way as soon as I find something permanent." "Eleanor, you're not in my way. You're helping me put this house to better use than storing memories and rattling around by myself." Within a month, the second bedroom was occupied by Harold Chen, a retired postal worker whose rental house had been damaged in a kitchen fire and whose insurance settlement wasn't sufficient to cover temporary housing while repairs were completed. Harold had delivered mail in Willow Bend for 25 years, knew every family in every street, and had always been unfailingly courteous and reliable. Having Eleanor and Harold in the house transformed the atmosphere completely. Morning coffee conversations about local news and neighborhood changes, evening discussions about gardening and home maintenance, the comfortable companionship of people who'd lived long enough to understand what mattered and what didn't. The local news coverage came as a surprise. Patricia Williams from the Railroad Museum had mentioned the housing project to a reporter from the Medford Mail Tribune, who wanted to do a feature story about innovative approaches to senior housing issues. I'd agreed to the interview reluctantly, preferring to let the work speak for itself. "Mr. Harlow's approach addresses multiple problems simultaneously," the reporter wrote. "Rural seniors get dignified transitional housing, large family homes get purposeful use, and communities retain experienced residents who might otherwise be forced to relocate to urban areas with more services but less social connection." The article included quotes from Eleanor and Harold about the program's impact on their lives, from county social services about the need for such housing options, and from neighbors who supported the project as good for the community. It was the kind of positive publicity that attracts attention from both supporters and critics. The criticism came primarily from Dennis and Samantha, who saw the housing project as another example of my irresponsible financial decisions and inappropriate use of family assets. The criticism was delivered through mutual acquaintances rather than direct conversation. But the message was clear. I was wasting their inheritance on strangers instead of preserving it for family. The support came from everywhere else. Phone calls from other seniors interested in similar arrangements, letters from adult children who wished their parents had access to such options, inquiries from social service agencies about expanding the program to other properties. More personally satisfying were the small daily interactions that made the house feel alive again. Eleanor baking cookies that filled the kitchen with aromas I hadn't enjoyed since Martha's time. Harold maintaining the garden with the systematic care of someone who understood that growing things required patience and attention. Dinner conversations that ranged from local history to current events, from personal memories to community concerns. These were the kinds of relationships I'd been missing without realizing it. Mutual respect between equals, shared responsibility for common spaces, appreciation expressed through actions rather than words. Eleanor and Harold treated me as a friend and benefactor, not as a resource to be managed or an obligation to be endured. The contrast with my family relationships couldn't have been starker. Eleanor thanked me daily for the housing arrangement, and constantly looked for ways to contribute to household maintenance and community. Harold insisted on paying nominal rent, even though I'd told him it wasn't necessary, because self-respecting people pay their own way when they can. Meanwhile, Dennis and Samantha continued treating my generosity as entitlement, while complaining about my selfishness in supporting community programs instead of preserving assets for their eventual inheritance. The irony was perfect. Strangers showed more genuine appreciation for my kindness than family members who assumed they deserved it. October brought the news I'd been expecting. Dorothy Peterson called with barely contained excitement. "Frank, you'll never guess what I saw this morning." Dennis and Samantha had a for sale sign planted in their front yard, and a moving truck backed up to their garage. The house sale was inevitable once they understood the legal realities of their situation. Between the IRS penalties for unreported income, the loan repayment demand, and the uncertain ownership of their primary residence, their financial position had become untenable. They were cutting their losses and relocating somewhere less expensive. Do you know where they're moving? The legal notice arrived the following week. Dennis and Samantha were formally surrendering any claim to the property at 847 Maple Street, in exchange for my agreement not to pursue immediate collection of the outstanding loan balance. They would make monthly payments according to a schedule worked out between Leo and their attorney, and I would regain full control of the house they'd been living in for 20 years. That evening, sitting on my porch with Eleanor and Harold, I received the final communication I'd been expecting from my family. A brief note from Samantha, handwritten on plain paper. "Dad, I hope you're satisfied with what you've accomplished. You've destroyed our family and ruined our lives for the sake of proving some point about respect. I hope it was worth it." I showed the note to Eleanor, who read it with the expression of someone who'd raised 4 children and recognized emotional manipulation when she saw it. "Frank, some people never learn that respect is earned through giving it, not demanding it." As I folded the note and put it away, I whispered the words that felt like a final judgment. "Good men don't beg for thanks, Eleanor. They earn respect through their actions, and they protect their dignity because nobody else will do it for them." The house felt more like home than it had in years, filled with people who appreciated its value and contributed to its care. Outside, the first autumn leaves were falling from the Douglas firs, but inside, the warmth of genuine community made everything feel like springtime. The train ticket lay on my kitchen table like a promise finally being kept. Portland to Seattle, Seattle to Vancouver, Vancouver to Jasper, through the Canadian Rockies to destinations Martha and I had dreamed about during 40 years of planning trips we never took. Now I was taking the trip alone, but taking it nonetheless, because 81 years old doesn't mean dead, and widow doesn't mean finished. Eleanor and Harold had insisted they could manage the house while I was gone, treating my travel plans with the enthusiasm of people who understood that adventure doesn't expire at retirement age. "You've been taking care of everyone else for years," Eleanor had said. "It's time you took care of yourself for a change." The Amtrak Empire Builder left Portland's Union Station at 4:45 p.m., right on schedule the way passenger trains used to run before airlines convinced people that speed mattered more than the journey itself. Freight trains and passenger trains are different experiences entirely. Freight is about efficiency, tonnage, schedules measured in days rather than hours. Passengers are about comfort, scenery, the luxury of movement without the responsibility of operation. The Columbia River Gorge unfolded outside my window as we climbed toward the Cascade Mountains. The same route I'd traveled thousands of times in locomotive cabs, but never as someone free to simply watch and appreciate. The late afternoon light turned the river into molten gold, and the autumn colors on the Oregon side contrasted beautifully with the Washington cliffs across the water. Dinner in the dining car was a civilized affair. Real plates, actual silverware, conversation with strangers who were taking the train because they chose to rather than because they had to. A retired teacher from Sacramento heading to visit grandchildren in Montana. A young couple from Germany who wanted to see America the way it existed before interstate highways. An elderly woman traveling alone like me, going to Glacier National Park because she'd promised her late husband they'd see it together someday. That evening settled into my sleeping berth with the gentle rocking motion that only trains provide. I thought about Martha for the first time in months without sadness overwhelming the memories. She would have loved this trip, the mountain scenery, the dining car conversations, the luxury of unhurried travel through landscapes too beautiful for highway speeds. More than that, she would have been proud of what I'd accomplished since her death. The housing project, the museum donations, the scholarship fund, even the family confrontation that had been necessary to protect my dignity and independence. Martha had always said I was too generous for my own good, too willing to accommodate other people's expectations at the expense of my own dreams. Frank, she used to say, being kind doesn't mean being weak. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's selfishness. I'd finally learned that lesson, 25 years too late, but not too late to matter. The second day brought the Montana plains and the beginning of serious mountain country as we approached the Continental Divide. The landscape was vast and humbling, the kind of scenery that reminds you how small individual problems are in the context of geological time and geographic scale. My family conflicts, my financial arrangements, my housing projects, all important to the people involved, all insignificant compared to mountains that had been standing for millions of years. That perspective was liberating rather than depressing. It meant I could focus on what actually mattered, relationships based on mutual respect, contributions to community welfare, personal independence, maintained through careful planning and decisive action. The rest was just noise, and I was finally old enough to ignore noise. Glacier National Park was everything the brochures had promised, and more than Martha's travel magazines had conveyed. Snow-capped peaks reflected in alpine lakes, wildlife that seemed unaware of human presence, hiking trails that challenged my 81-year-old legs, but rewarded the effort with views that made every step worthwhile. I spent 3 days in the park, staying at a lodge that catered to seniors who appreciated comfort but weren't afraid of adventure. The other guests were people like me, older adults who'd finally decided to prioritize their own dreams instead of everyone else's expectations. We shared stories of postponed trips, delayed adventures, family obligations that had consumed decades of potential memories. The conversations were enlightening. Almost everyone had similar experiences with adult children who assumed their parents' resources and time were family property to be managed for maximum inheritance preservation. Almost everyone had reached similar conclusions about the importance of independent decision-making in later life. My son kept telling me I was too old to travel internationally, said a woman from Arizona who was heading to Scotland alone at age 79. So I stopped telling him about my travel plans. Now he gets postcards from places he's never heard of, and he's finally started treating me like someone whose opinions matter. Her approach was more diplomatic than mine had been, but the underlying principle was identical. Respect that isn't freely given must sometimes be earned through demonstration of independence and consequence. Adult children who want to maintain relationships with their parents need to offer those relationships on terms of mutual respect rather than condescending management. The return journey to Portland gave me time to draft the letter I'd been composing mentally for months. Not to Dennis and Samantha, who had made their positions clear and would have to live with the consequences of their choices. Madison had been the one grandchild who still asked about my railroad stories, who helped with garden projects, who seemed genuinely interested in family history and community connections. She deserved to understand what had happened and why, and she deserved to know that her grandfather's decisions weren't motivated by anger, but by the desire to preserve dignity and demonstrate proper priorities. The letter took me 3 drafts to get right. It needed to explain the situation without criticizing her parents directly, needed to convey lessons about respect and independence without sounding preachy, needed to offer hope for future relationship while acknowledging current realities. Dear Madison, I wrote, by the time you read this, you'll probably have heard various explanations for why your grandfather disappeared for a while and why your family's circumstances changed so dramatically. I want you to understand the situation from my perspective, not because I need to justify my decisions, but because someday you might face similar choices about how to maintain your dignity when people you love stop treating you with respect. The letter continued for 3 pages, describing the birthday dinner that had triggered everything, explaining the difference between being generous and being taken for granted, outlining the steps I'd taken to protect my independence and resources. But the most important part was the conclusion. Madison, I've established a trust fund that will pay for your college education, trade school, or technical training, whatever path you choose that develops your abilities and serves your interests. The money comes with only one condition. You must earn it through your own efforts, not through entitlement or assumption that someone else owes you success. More than money, I want you to remember that respect is earned through giving it, that generosity should be appreciated rather than expected, and that family relationships work best when everyone contributes something valuable instead of just taking what they want. Your grandfather loves you, Madison, and wants you to have opportunities to build a life based on your own choices rather than other people's expectations. Use this gift wisely, and remember that the best way to honor someone's generosity is to pass it forward when your own circumstances allow. I sealed the letter in an envelope addressed to Madison at her school, where she could read it privately without immediate interference from her parents. Leo would deliver it along with documentation for the Education Trust, ensuring that she understood both the opportunity and the responsibilities that came with it. At Crown Point, where the gorge opens up to reveal layers of geological history carved by centuries of river flow, I stood at the viewing platform and thought about persistence. Water cutting through rock, not through force but through consistent pressure applied over vast periods of time. My own situation had been similar, years of accumulated pressure finally resulting in fundamental change. The difference was, geological change happens without consciousness or intent. Human change requires decision, action, and the willingness to accept consequences that might be uncomfortable but are ultimately necessary. I'd spent too many years being water that accommodated obstacles instead of water that carved new channels. Back in Portland, waiting for the bus that would take me back to Willow Bend, I bought a postcard showing Mount Hood reflected in one of the alpine lakes I'd hiked to during my mountain adventure. On the back, I wrote a simple message: "The view from here is spectacular. Sometimes the best trips are the ones you take by yourself. When you finally stop waiting for someone else's permission to see the world." I addressed the postcard to myself and dropped it in the mailbox outside Union Station, a reminder that would arrive in a few days, when I was back in my routine but needed to remember that routine was a choice, not a requirement, and that 81 years old was old enough to know better, but young enough to keep learning. The bus ride through the Cascade Mountains gave me time to think about what came next. Eleanor and Harold would continue living in the house as long as they needed transitional housing. The scholarship fund would start awarding grants to local students who wanted to learn practical skills. The museum would continue its educational programs with financial security I'd helped provide, and I would continue living independently, making my own decisions, traveling when I wanted to travel, giving my time and resources to people and organizations that treated them as gifts rather than entitlements. It was a good plan for whatever time I had left, whether that was 5 years or 15. The evening light was perfect, golden and warm and full of possibilities that hadn't existed a year ago when I'd felt invisible and taken for granted. Now I felt visible in the ways that mattered to myself, to my community, to people who understood the value of what I had to offer. I was no longer forgotten, just finally free.